Hey, so this is like a relatively informal kind of like book review. So where I spend a minute like kind of talking about a book that I recently read that I thought might be relevant or interesting to certain people that might want to read it, maybe not want to read it. To be honest, it's not really a minute. It's much more like 4 or 5 minutes. I don't. I want to follow the Lacanian kind of session idea, and I don't want the information to be constrained by any limiting factors. I want the information to be conveyed along the time it was meant to be conveyed. So the book I'm going to be talking about is a verso edition of the three essays on the theory of sexuality. Um, Now, what's interesting about this one, by Freud. What's interesting about this one is this is the 1905 edition, so not the one that you would find in later standard editions. And what's really interesting here is that there's a lot of revisions that Freud will end up making to the later versions to reincorporate a lot of his newer theories that were developing at the time. But in 1905, when he was still much more early on, because like Interpretation of Dreams is only published in 1900, it's really early on for Freud, so he doesn't really have the same ideas that he will come to develop later on. And so that are already like familiar with the three essays of sexuality, this version is kind of substantially shorter because of the additions that were later added on. One of the fun things about this one is that the Oedipus complex, the famous thing that you would assume for most of the later psychoanalytic theories of sexuality and development, isn't really like that prominent in this. There's like a footnote that kind of mentions it, but it's not really super relevant to this book. So there's a lot of differences and revisions, which is why these guys wanted to put this book out. Basically broken down into three major essays. So it's called the three theories. Uh, so this is, you'll see here, sexual operations, infantile sexuality, and transformations of puberty. So typically critiquing earlier theorists from this kind of day that were like the top notch in the field. So like Kraft Ebing and Havelock Ellis. And so a lot of them had a very evolutionary perspective on sexualities. Their theories, sexual interaction is always for reproduction in the end. That's that kind of teleology they place in it. Trying to distinguish himself from these earlier thinkers. So a lot of them had lists of perversions or other weird kind of activities that they saw as not normal sexuality. And what Freud did is he was looking at these and he's like, wait, so if sexuality has to be for reproduction, there's plenty of things we do, such as kissing and all these other various interactions, that really aren't ostensibly for reproduction that we do and consider normal. So there's clearly some issues here with this conception that every kind of sexuality has to be for reproduction. So this radical questioning of the status quo and the theories at the time allows this first section to be so liberationary for certain ideas. In the next section is Freud lays out the area for how his theory of sexuality will develop. Now that he leaves the space open in the realm of these earlier theories. And in this one, for his theory, he basically splits it up into two phases. You see really developed in the second one. Puberty changes to a genital focus, and before that, it's a kind of autoerotic focus for sexuality. So the sexuality is focused on the self, and then when it comes to maturation in around puberty, it then becomes focused on the more genital object. And the section where it becomes focused on the genital object, that is really found in the third section. And that's kind of where Freud kind of reneges on his earlier point and brings back in this kind of teleology here. And so this is kind of also this third section where it's the kind of the sketchier one, I think, regarding what would be a kind of moral or accurate conception of sexual progression in our contemporary period. So he uses this teleology to explain why the perversions occur. And so those occur when the fixation becomes on some other object. It's this other object that distracts the sexuality and makes it go towards this direction. So that's what he would consider the inverts, which would be like homosexual, what we consider homosexuality. That's what he thinks, that's how that arises. They focus on something else instead of the traditional, what he expects to be the normative genital focus object at the end. Now, what's kind of interesting here is because obviously he still has this like very heteronormative perspective for sexuality, but because this is kind of this pre-Oedipal complex where you have all this variation, so it's the early period where the sexuality could become so many other things. So like if you get rid of this presupposition for this like kind of heteronormative sexuality, if you don't just presuppose that it has to end up being the genital focus in the end, and if you allow the various other forms of sexuality, you end up with a kind of what could be like a psychoanalytic foundation for a much broader range of sexualities that doesn't end up with the kind of rigidity that you would see in the like kind of later Freudian conceptions. So that's why I think it's relevant. It was not a terrible read. He still sometimes says some kind of problematic stuff towards the end, especially. But it's also 1905, so keep that in mind. Anyway, so that was my thoughts on this. If you really enjoyed this like overview, what really makes this book is that introduction at the beginning, because that kind of lays out what the authors or the editor and the authors of the introduction were trying to get at, why this book is different from these later editions that you may have read of the theories of sexuality, and how this leaves space open for like kind of an LGBTQIA or like a transgender approach to sexuality within psychoanalysis that you can't find in just the standard edition. So hopefully this was fun. See ya.